Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank the organizer of the meeting, Mr. Sixt Wetzler, for the invitation. He has honored me as one of 4 main speakers, but I'm guessing this is also associated with expectations that are not likely to be small. And just a preliminary remark. As I got the invitation, I told it to my wife, Doris, and she answered, "Oh, that's fine for you." And my reaction was, "Oh, no, I don't think so, because I have to give the lecture in English." Her answer, "Okay, that's bad for your audience." And I think in following, you will understand what she meant. Okay, I begin. I would like to take a closer look at a topic that I have repeatedly dealt within my publications, but which has not received systematic treatment with regard to its historical development, and which I subsume under the title "From the Freeze Frame to the Cinematic Illusion: Early Modern German Fencing Literature and its Contribution to the Visualization and Objectification of Internalized Motion Pictures." The developmental presentation of the subject is, on the one hand, of particular scholarly interest because, as a longitudinal study, it can show how the progressive economization of a society leads to the emergence of corresponding media, as well as a tendency to economize movement in general and motoric learning in particular. In the end, this means that there is a social expectation that everything which is made or created should be produced as effectively as possible. I can't present this thesis comprehensively and in sufficient detail here and now. For this reason, the following paper will provide exemplification from a few selected historical documents. 2 other reasons justify this topic. Combat books give us an insight into historical movement patterns of fighting. The fact that these patterns of movement are determined not only anthropologically or by the kind of weapon used, but are socially conditioned and thus subject to change, is generally accepted and does not need to be elaborated further. Just one example. The fact that wrestling is perceived and esteemed throughout the Middle Ages as a symbol of a culture power and not as an aesthetically oriented culture of movement is not due to a motoric arsenal which is limited only to the physical power of the human body, but to its social standardization. Since these norms changed at the threshold of modern age and no one could be found who made wrestling motoric skills aesthetically similar to fencing, wrestling lost its original attractivity and acceptance amongst the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Let us now turn to the 2 explanations frequently given for this. Explanation 1. Some authors of combat books emphasize the textbook character of their writings, such as the author of the Egenol Fechtbuch from the 1530s. His intention is the education of youth to fight, and he also expresses this openly. So haben sie hiermit Unterweisung, sich des Feinds im Feld mit der Hand zu erwehren, angezeigt. Explanation 2. For a few years now, a global community has formed to establish the historical modes of fighting as a modern sport. They must necessarily draw their knowledge of the manner of fighting and their own body experience in this kind of fighting from the combat books. Thus, the early modern German combat books are given the function of pedagogical textbooks. This, of course, leads us to the question whether the fighting books can at all provide what their authors claim for them and what today's historical fanciers expect from them. I begin with a quotation from the Nuremberg manuscript 3227a from Lichtenauer, which is always used to illustrate the problems which arise whenever written instruction is used to describe motoric activity. Auch merke das und wisse, dass man nicht gar eigentlich und bedeutlich von dem Fechten mag schreiben, sagen und schreiben oder auslegen, als man es wohl mag zeigen und weisen mit der Hand. The author, from the time around 1389, therefore, clearly gives priority to the haptic body experience. Written description or language are secondary. He draws attention to a problem that his 150-year younger colleague, who wants to create a pedagogical textbook for the young generation, does not seem to recognize. I don't want to explain what the author has been said at the time around 1389. For me, it is evident. Rather, I would like to read between the lines in order to point to what has been left unsaid in this quotation. What is remarkable in this context is the following. Exclusively focused on the problem of textualization, this educated writer does not even seem to think of the possibility of pictorial support accompanying the text. This is all the more surprising since such pictorial illustration was already used alongside the written instruction in the single combat in the first known fencing manuscript 133, dating from the time around 1300. Nevertheless, the Zeigen und Weisen mit der Hand doesn't only refer to haptic, but also to visual perception, which is also a great importance in the mental processing and preparation of motoric skills. Why is this aspect completely out of the focus of the author? One reason, and I would like to restrict myself to this point, why the most effective German fencing theory, which is not so German after all because it is fed from the most diverse European sources, is not provided with illustrations and first published, lies in the fact that Lichtenauer's mnemonic rhymes about fencing with a long sword contain no real practical interpretation of fencing motoric skills. Based on the mnemonic rhymes, the basics and principles of Lichtenauer's doctrine, guided by theory, are worked out. In this way, the terse mnemonic rhymes preserve a good portion of their secrecy. Only by the subsequent generations of fencing masters who interpret the doctrine of Lichtenauer, that means that their writings are pragmatically orientated in a way as they want to place their focus on the representation or mediation of individual motoric skills, the mnemonic rhymes will be illustrated and at the same time will be opened up the original closed recipient circle. In what way the combat writings and images can actually convey motoric skills in the sense of a successful instruction, I have tried to point out in my publication of Baumann's combat manuscript. This will still be a theme, however, differently evaluated, regardless of the question of the real pragmatic usability of illustrated text for the pure text lectures. This has already been answered negatively by Lichtenauer. A further underlying intention can be recognized just by its way of presentation. To come straight to the point, the combat books of fencers and wrestlers are principally memory writings in two aspects. On the one hand, the doctrines brought to paper in word, as in word and picture by well-known fencing masters of the 14th and 15th century, such as Ringmeister Ott, Andreas Liegnitzer, Martin Hunfeld, Peter von Danzig, Hans Thalhofer, Paulus Kahl, and others, are memory writings in the sense of a memory culture with which the authors want to draw the attention of coming generations to their existence, to their special knowledge and their special position within their field of activity. An existence that would have disappeared in the anonymity of history without the written affiliations. The fact that we can deal again with these masters and their writings shows that they have managed to escape from this anonymity. On the other hand, in spite of their differences in this area, they are also memory writings in the sense of an acquisition culture, which is characteristic of a psychomotoric learning process. And precisely this acquisition culture is a real starting point of what I have to say today. In doing so, I want to rely on the findings of psychology and kinetics within the sport science. They form the actual basis of my line of argumentation, which therefore has to be discussed in appropriate brevity and without too much detail. The learning of a motoric skill is essentially based on its practical implementation, zeigen und weisen mit der Hand, to resume the quotation. It underlines in this context, on the one hand, the immediate possibility of manual movement correction through the master without the detour of language. In this way, the learner gets important haptic body stimuli which otherwise cannot be mediated by any other means. On the other hand, it emphasizes the function of demonstration by the teacher himself, which means his own performance of movement under the watchful eyes of the learner for the purpose of imitation. The Zeigen und Weisen mit der Hand of the medieval specialist practitioner is certainly based on his own experience, on a long tradition of learning by doing. We can hardly assume that he was able to reflect and analyze the motoric learning process in the same way as cognitive psychology and neurobiology today are able to do. His socialization as a fighter and then his own teaching activity in the cultural technique of fighting taught him that motoric skills could be mediated primarily by physically real predisposition and simultaneous correction and reaffirmation of the movement. About 630 years after Lichtenauer, we know the mechanisms and underlying neurophysiological processes of motoric learning and can explain and depict what Lichtenauer could perhaps only guess and describe inadequately. If we look at the basic structure of motoric learning, we can represent it in a control circuit model in accordance with cybernetics. One goal of all motoric learning, and thus the basis for the desired permanent change in behavior, is the development of an inner image of the motion. This image of motion is, as you will see, corrected and confirmed by different media until it corresponds to the correct movement sequence demonstrated at the beginning, and then it can be stored in the memory of movement, which means in the motor cortex in the brain. In the following, I will refrain from explaining all the verbal and kinesthetic parts of this process and will devote myself to the visual medium and thus to the part of illustration. At the beginning of the exercise is Lichtenauer's Zeigen und Weisen mit der Hand. That means the visual demonstration by the teacher has the priority. The visual recording of this performance is accompanied by a mental appropriation of the learner. The mental appropriation as such is always contextual. The context, which is built by the two poles, moving and standing reality, determines the type of recording technique. We can describe this technique in general as follows. An external object which is at rest is stored as such in the memory. The outer real still life becomes an inner mental image similar to a photographically fixed image. The visual demonstration of a motorical skill, on the other hand, is a progressive spatial temporal event which presents to the eye, by virtue of its anatomical and physiological limitations, the movement in its holistic form and is stored as such in the memory of movement. That means in the mental appropriation of an external flow of movement, storage cannot be reached through a single image, but through cinematic adaptation. That is by the linear succession of innumerable individual images, which cannot be perceived as such because of the speed of the process and the inertia of the eye. We can assume that this process of appropriation also applies to medieval mankind. We are still on the same anthropological stage of evolution. This in turn means that long before we were able to reproduce the physical reality of movement on external material storage media in the same way and call it a film, we already had the capacity for mental filming. To know this and to be able to name it was not important as long as Master Lichtenauer and his colleagues could convey their knowledge and skills in a communication situation that corresponded to a face-to-face interaction between teacher and student. The knowledge of the mental processes of motoric learning presented a special challenge only from that time on, when Lichtenauer and his colleagues wanted to preserve their knowledge and skills in a safer way of remembrance to posterity than it is the verbal and physically demonstrative propagation, depending on the person, on place and time. However, as soon as a demonstration and thus the information medium changes, while retaining the original aim as a transcription of fencing and wrestling skills on the part of research is repeatedly underlined and is also emphasized by some authors, mainly in the 16th century, then precisely this aim of maintaining the original information value for the purpose of the mental filming and reproducing, independent of person, time and space, becomes a challenge of its own for the writer and the recording medium. In what way? The author must first be aware of the problem of information loss, which results from the pure transcription of movement, where the visual demonstration must be compensated by a literature language. However, because of the transcription, the teacher-student relationship only acts as a virtual one in the background. This excludes the possibility of equivalent and simultaneous linguistic, manual, and visual correction of the movement execution by the teacher. Written instructions must be manifold more precise and detailed. In order to further minimize the loss of information and in order to increase the vividness, the pictoriality of the written, Yeah.
Ja, 1, 2, 3, 4.
In order to further minimize the loss of information and in order to increase the vividness, the pictoriality of the written, it is necessary in a second step, the one-time visual demonstration by the teacher, which should give the learner only a picture, more accurate a film, to bring it by means of an imagery in the literal sense to paper. Thus, in addition to the awareness of the problem itself, the faithful reproduction of movement to an external medium for the purpose of its cinematic readaptation with the third party also becomes an artisanal technical challenge, a challenge which could only be solved about 550 years after the publication of Illustrated Fencing Doctrine of the Manuscript 133. Many intermediate steps were necessary until Edward Maybridge was able to develop series of photographic works. Maybridge succeeded in capturing the space-time dimension of motion photographically in several individual images and reproducing it in series. In order to reproduce a movement as an external cinematographic parallel reality, it was then only necessary to realize that the visual impression of real motion results from a series of 15 individual images per second from the inertia of the human eye. If, however, the motion, in this case, a kind of hip, Hiranda, has to be imitated due to its real-time film, then the eye is completely overwhelmed. Because of the speed, it cannot perceive important details of the movement. Consequently, these details cannot be stored in the movement memory either. Only by separating the total movement into many freeze frames, which follow one after the other, as Maybridge shows, important for the total movement necessary details become recognizable. These details are indispensable for the correct image of movement, the inner film, and thus the execution of the movement by yourself. We can summarize this by saying, to make the pictorial mediation of motion successful, that means in our case, the pictorial mediation of technical skills, the basic condition is the visually perceptible separation. If starting from Maybridge, we wish to look back to the history of the pictorial visualization of movement, and if we wish to reconstruct it, it is natural to consider all the sources which document moving reality or pretend to do so. Then, of course, we also have to ask, which distance marks the combat books in this context? The pictorial documentation of motoric skills accompanies the literature which imports the knowledge of fencing and wrestling teachers since its beginnings. This can be as an illustration of sometimes more or less detailed written description of the movement, such as in the manuscript 133, dating from the time around 1300, such as in the Gladiatoria manuscripts from the 1420 till 1440, or such as in the later part of Codex 1642, Baumann-Fechtbuch, from the years around 47-2. This can be as an illustration of partly cryptic mnemonic rhymes, such as in the manuscript 5012 by Peter Faulkner from the year 1419. This can be as an illustration of a scarce inscription, such as it predominantly occurs with Paulus Kahl and Hans Thalhofer. This can be as a pictorial documentation without any written accompanying text, such as it is the case with the two fencing masters mentioned before, or exclusively in the older part of the Baumann-Fechbuch manuscript, also mentioned above, dating around 1420. It is precisely when we wish to shed more light on the instructional character of these documents and want to find out whether the variability on the text level with its different content of information also affects the image level, we have to ask ourselves, is thus a merely naming text illustrated differently from one describing the movement, and is there also an image-forming difference between the textless images and the text-related images? We see from these examples that the variability on the text level does not correspond to the image level. That means, while the textual information becomes increasingly sparse up to the point of non-information, the design of the illustrations still remains the same. What does it look like? In all four examples, only a very short moment is taken from the overall movement and is fixed in a single freeze frame. This type of drawing design, in its insistence on a single solidified group of figure, makes it impossible to compensate the lessening of the textual information. This leads to the following conclusion. In the effort to convey a correct image of the movement, the freeze frame does not make the text unnecessary. On the contrary, the freeze frame demands a detailed textual description of the movement. Well, this leads us to the question about the reception, respectively the meaning of such an illustration. Jan Dirk Müller sees, with reference to Thalhofer's manuscripts, in the imagery a guide for literally untrained, primarily distinguished students. He also emphasizes the textbook character of these writings. However, the external control of the mental film in the way of a textbook, both by the descriptive and the merely indicative text, remains very error-prone, even in connection with the illustrated freeze frame, which is actually intended to provide more clarity and vividness. I cannot explain this here in details, so I refer to my already mentioned publication, which analyzes these errors. Six that this publication is available, yes? Okay. As a result, however, I would like to point out that the statement Pictura est quedam literatura illiterator, picture is the literature for people who can read, okay. Which is based on the Reichenauer abbot Wallerfried von Strabo, and which Jan Dirk Müller adapts in his argumentation, has no validity for the picture world of the early modern German combat books. Even for the Christian iconography to which it was originally related, this dictum of the Reichenau abbot may be questioned. However, what interests us more today concerning defective freeze frame reproduction is a question whether, with advancing time and with the increase of fencing and wrestling literature, the authors became aware of this problem and developed a more elaborate illustration. May I quote once more Jan-Dirk Müller, who seems to agree with this. And I agree partly with him when he writes at the beginning, the image can, for example, present more precisely the basic position or starting position of a particular piece, and with a huge number of images, a sequence of movement divided into individual phases can also be illustrated. The picture codes of Hans Thalhofer try to achieve this in both respects. It thus Hans Thalhofer, with his fencing literature, the forerunner of the legendary TV comedian Bob Monkhouse. Bob's TV series fascinated spectators like me from 1965 onwards. In Germany, it had the title Als die Bilder laufen lernten, when the pictures learned to run. Is therefore Thalhofer not only a specialist in the battlefield? Does he not only teach nobles in the divine court? Doesn't he fight a duel with Paulus Karl in front of Duke Albrecht in Munich and is thereby literally hit with a Querhau in die Hand geschnitten und auf den Kopf geschlagen? Perhaps you now understand my great sympathy for the underdog Paulus Karl, who was little appreciated by research in comparison to Hans Thalhofer. Isn't Thalhofer not only an outstanding archivist of contemporary everyday reality of fencing, but isn't he also the theoretical mastermind, innovator and pioneer of a subjective graphic visualization of a path of movement fixed on parchment or paper? Without again referring to Maybridge as a provisional climax of the objective moving reproduction of real reality, the drill instructions of the military literature of the early 17th century show how such a graphical and thus subjectively designed visualization can look like. In this context, I would mention the writings of Johann Jakob Wallhausen or Jacob de Gain's Drillkunst, whose detectives can be traced back to the Oranic army reform and the war book of Count Johann VII of Nassau-Siegen. Though the images still have the definity in this regard, that they are still individualizing and not mobile, since the pictures, however, show us a total movement by a linear small part playback. That means through innumerable freeze frames, the viewer gets a strictly controlled mental flow of movement from outside, which permits as little as possible potential self-interpretative fantasies. Limited by the sheet format, the 42 movement phases are printed on a total of 22 continuous sheets, which I trimmed here and clipped together, though that in reality no visually uninterrupted linearity can be achieved. Nevertheless, such linearity becomes theoretically possible. Then the pictures are printed on the front of each sheet by a rapid page down. I remember the famous flip book. The illusion of a movement flow is principally possible. With Jacob de Gain's Drillkunst, the war practitioners of the beginning of the 17th century seem to have solved a fundamental problem of motoric learning with the help of books. On the one hand, the entire movement in its execution, that means its cinematic reproduction by manual fast down paging, is visually perceptible, and on the other hand, a self-ascertainment of movement phases by innumerable freeze frames is possible at any time. The effort to release motoric learning in real face-to-face communication and to convey it in the sense of a textbook is achieved by the greatest possible interaction between text and image. So, for example, each freeze frame on the head page is designated, and at the same time it receives its most detailed description of the movement on the opposite side. Doing this, the text also provides information that the image cannot convey even in the case of a very small segmentation. This can be, for example, informations which can be attributed in the wider sense to the kinesthetic feeling. The almost endless seeming strip of pictures in its immediate reconnection to an equally linear progressing information-loaded text intends, as already mentioned, to release the learning of movement from the context of the real face-to-face communication and to integrate it into a new non-animated medium. This gives the musketeer theoretically the opportunity to train the movement around the clock. Thus, the human body becomes the instrument of military drills with the aim of its exclusively performance-oriented optimization. The economization of the body with the primacy of absolute efficiency finds here its first medial highlight. This is done with the greatest possible approximation to the animated reality. I want to describe the result as fixed second reality. To shape this as illustrated is only possible because the writers of the military literature have ample didactic and methodic knowledge. An intellectual, we can also say learned debate, must have preceded, even it is only documented in its results. Without these illusion theoretic reflections, I do insist, these writings would also have been stuck to the isolated freeze frame if one had not already been able to base on image technical exemplary preliminary works. Preliminary works such as the early fencing instructors could have done. This brings us back to Thalhofer again, and we consider his mode of presentation, for example, in the Munich manuscript Code Icon 394a, published in 1467, probably under his last personal instruction. Compared to his earlier manuscripts, most of which document Thalhofer's time schedule of assignments as fencing instructors for the judicial combat, this manuscript is far less narrative. With the exception of a few examples, the illustrations are freed from a narrative pictorial work surrounding them. The concentration of the viewer is deliberately directed at the presented technical skill, and thus one of the basic requirements for the determination as a textbook seems to be given for the first time. The proportion of the written submission is limited to short texts of different rhetorical nature. In no case, however, do they reach the value of the description of these military writings. If you look at the 75 illustrations of the fencing with a longsword of the manuscript, the following picture emerges. On the one hand, we have the short inscriptions and technical terms, which, if they do not belong to Lichtenauer's type of Merkverstypus, which refuses to allow the uninitiated person per se an outer dynamic comprehensibility, and the mental design of image tempt the ignorant, inexperienced observer at best to an unguided free illusion. The freeze frame gives this illusion, as we described it earlier in other manuscripts, a first fixed point. There are usually no further fixed points. That means in these cases, the observer does not receive further pictorial information about the before and or the after. In these cases, none of the two media, image and text, exceeds the informative value of the other. 45 illustrations out of the total of 75 illustrations that show non-armored combat with a long and short sword belong to this picture pattern in patent 5.7.33. From a purely iconographic point of view, another 25 illustrations also belong to the freeze frame type. Their value in no way surpasses that of the previous category and is related to the represented moment. Only in the intermediate reference by the attached text, another pictorial fixed point is possible. I call this type of representation rhetorical one-phase segmentation. It occurs in two forms. As rhetorical one-phase segmentation without iconographic evidence. It is expressed in terms like aus dem Oberhau gefallen in das Gewappnet-Ort, aus dem freien Hau gefallen in das Gewappnet-Ort, aus dem Schiller gefallen in das Gewappnet-Ort. In this category, rhetorical reference is made to a preceding starting position, which in turn has no pictorial correspondence. The specialist who already has a movement picture on the Termini Technici Oberhau and Schiller is now in a position, starting from an only written documented starting position over the drawn and different fighting position to form a mental curse log of the movement execution. He thus receives usable information about the before. However, he does not receive any information about the how. Knowing this is also indispensable for the expert, since there are always several motorical action possibilities in the combat in order to switch from position A to position B. The layman, on the other hand, still has only the information of the freeze frame. The correct pictorial mental storage of the rhetorical information about the starting position is denied him. The second, iconographically more vivid manifestation in this category is presented as rhetoric one-phase segmentation with iconographic evidence. In this case, the information content of both rhetorical information is extended by a single freeze frame. In concrete terms, the starting position is illustrated just once, without any information on how to get into this starting position. The picture of the initial situation is iconographically given the function of a reference image, and all technical skills that take place from this position are reproduced by a single freeze frame. However, a systematic structure in the arrangement is not apparent in the manuscript. This is illustrated for the first time on folio 7 recto, the technical skill aus dem Anbinden hinwegstoßen hinter dem Ellbogen fassen. The Anbinden itself, that is the starting position, but only on folio 21 recto. Also, the 11 techniques which are applied from this starting position are not listed linearly one after the other, but are distributed from 7 recto to 31 verso. Even though choir distortions cannot yet be definitely ruled out, a correct gapless linear sequence, and this would have to be the case if the author had intended an imaginative instruction for the layman, cannot be achieved even by leaf swapping. Also, the repeatedly required paging backwards, actually paging down, to the reference image in order to be able to ascertain the initial position and to be able to mentally trace and consolidate the curse of face complicates the correct movement perception. In terms of image technology and organization, this representation is in no way fully developed, even if the layman is now presented with 2 fixed pictorial points between which an illusion of the curse of movement appears possible. However, a reference between these 2 fixed points, which are spatially spaced apart from each other in the manuscript, is only made possible by the inscription aus dem Anbinden, which refers back to the starting position. Neither the inscription of the reference image nor the purely iconographical representation of both fixed points refer to a reciprocal relationship. It is only in the intermediary interaction with back reference that this kind of presentation on the development of the perception of movement gets its competency of information. However, this information competency is cut back when, as from 20 recto to 20 verso, the acting persons change sides. You see, the multiple occurrence of such a confusion, although in the other types of weapons, shows that this is not a single phenomenon which can be traced back to a draftman's attention losses, which inadvertently counterattacked an underlying conception of the author. In light of these shortcomings, it is difficult to attribute to the author a well-throughout theory of technology textbook. Basically, and this makes the previous remarks almost again obsolete, it is also not quite correct to speak of a motion segmentation in the examples shown. It is rather a movement action which is separated, as shown here on folio 8, into the 3 technical skills of Mordschlag, Reißen, Gesichtsstoß. The spatial and temporal progression of the human body, which is necessary for the execution of the Schlagen, Reißen, Stoßen, does not receive any further iconographic segmentation. How such a segmentation can look like can nevertheless be found at Thalhofer a single time, namely as a rhetorical 2-phase segmentation with iconographic proof. In iconographic linear resolution, Thalhofer segmentation does not reach the meaningful value of the higher resolution description of movement of the already mentioned military literature, but it has to be placed at the beginning of the evolutionary historical line of the purely iconographically resolved space time change of human motoric skills. However, assuming that Thalhofer is acting consciously in this context would go too far. On the one hand, the above-mentioned examples within Thalhofer's entire image corpus are clearly in the minority, and on the other, in the kind, as already mentioned, too erroneous. In terms of the historical impact, Thalhofer seems to me to have had no influence on the far more imaginative representations of military literature. But his work itself remains relatively isolated within his own professional community, and his face segmentations are not echoed by the following fencing authors. How can Thalhofer's illustration attempts to be finally described? Here too, it is necessary to differentiate. On the one hand, Thalhofer's pictorial technique is at the service of a superordinate narrative context. In these cases, it does not serve as a mnemonic tool to verify a technical skill. It is almost exclusively related to an individuated freeze frame and serves to document the combat in general, embedded in its various social utterances. Where Thalhofer puts his narrative aspiration aside, the technical skill as such becomes to the fore. To assume that he has created a textbook for beginners contradicts all the findings of motoric learning. Even if Thalhofer, in contrast to the pure still image, promotes the development of an imagination of move through intermedial and in rare cases through intermedial links, this process is often hampered or prevented by representational inadequacies. This means that Thalhofer's writings are not suitable as a textbook for laymen. Nevertheless, they serve as a reference work and picture encyclopedia for the contemporary expert. After this analysis, let us now return to the author of the Egenolf combat book. How is his statement to be understood against this background? Is his work, after all, even less expressive in the image composition than Thalhofer's work? Did he and all the other authors of early modern German combat books who work in a similar way in terms of performance miss their theme? Well, I consider an interpretation in this sense inappropriate. Just a few minutes. The Statement, so haben Sie hiermit Unterweisung, sich des Feinds im Feld mit der Hand zu erwehren, angezeigt, is to be interpreted rather in the sense that with the written and iconographic fixation, in addition to the orally handed down mnemonic rhyme and the real demonstration, a further memory supporting medium is now used in the instruction. A complete replacement of the teacher by the book, which thus becomes a textbook, was certainly not the intention of the authors. Thus, the written and iconographic fixation does not have to be completely mentally comprehensible to the layman, because they receive their complete resolution only in real lessons. Just as a mnemonic rhyme contains infinitely many shortenings, which are resolved in the real lesson or in the written exegesis. This brings me to a similar conclusion, which also Eric Burkart recently formulated in some of his articles, and I so remember me also yesterday. Johannes Lichtenauer has already let us know that motoric skills can never be conveyed entirely through pictorial and written media. Today, this part, which cannot be conveyed by any textbook, is, according to Pogliani, referred to as tacit knowing or embodied knowledge. No matter how you might translate these terms, which in the textbook is not communicable. For me, it is inseparably connected with the kinesthetic sensitivity. Whether and in which way the kinesthetic sensitivity represents a body knowledge or a body intelligence would be an extremely interesting topic, but with it we devote ourselves to a neurobiological theme and we leave the fancy book research for good. Dear ladies and gentlemen, these are the results of my research, and I would like to make one last comment. The combat books are fascinating historical witnesses, and they answer almost all our questions, be they of a philological, art historical, or social historical nature. But there is one thing they will never be able to do: to give people today the feeling and the knowledge that they can fight as the medieval swordsmen and wrestlers did. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for listening to me, and excuse my English, and please no questions.